Between 1888 and 1891, the East End of London was gripped with fear as 11 women were brutally murdered in the Whitechapel area. Was it the work of Jack the Ripper, or was something more sinister lurking in the shadows? Was Jack truly the only monster on the streets of Victorian London? Let's have a look. Not much is known about Emma Elizabeth Smith, and contemporary reports have it that she was a very private woman. The only information known about her was that in 1888 she was 45 years old, she claimed to be a widow, and had a son and a daughter living in the Finsbury Park area. Those who knew her said that she gave the impression that she may have come from a more privileged background. And this is entirely possible. If she had been reasonably well off as a result of her husband's profession, her circumstances could have declined to the point of poverty quite quickly after his death. She had no fixed address and lived at a common lodging house at 18 George Street. In the early hours of Tuesday the 3rd of April 1888, Emma was attacked by 2 or 3 men on the corner of Osborne Street and Brick Lane in Spitalfields. Emma survived the attack. She was severely injured, but somehow she managed to stagger back to the boarding house where she was staying, and the house deputy took her to the London hospital. There she was examined, and it was discovered that her peritoneum had been ruptured during this vicious attack, and as a result developed peritonitis. She may well have known her attackers. She was unable, or perhaps too afraid, to give a description other than that one had been a teenager. Sadly, she fell into a coma and died the following morning. Inspector Edmund Reed was in charge of the investigation into Emma's murder. However, no perpetrator was ever caught. Some believe that Emma was the first victim of Jack the Ripper, but many believe she was the victim of a gang. Like Emma Smith, 39-year-old Martha Tabram had no home of her own. She had been staying at a common lodging house on 19 George Street, next door to the one where Emma Smith had stayed. Martha had been married and they had had 2 sons. However, Martha's drinking had been too much for her husband and he had left her in 1875. Martha's body was first seen at the George Yard Buildings, Whitechapel, on Tuesday the 7th of August 1888, also following a bank holiday, at 3:30 by Albert Crow, a cab driver, returning home after a night shift. However, he believed her to be a rough sleeper, and it wasn't until she was discovered by a dock labourer on his way to work, John Saunders Reeves, that it was noticed that she was dead. Martha had been ferociously stabbed 39 times in the neck, torso and genitals by a right-handed assailant and a short knife. However, it was believed that one of the wounds may have been inflicted by a left hand. Was Martha the victim of multiple killers? Or was one man using both hands in a frenzied attack? Well, Martha's friend Mary Ann Connolly told the police that she and Martha had been drinking with 2 soldiers in the Angel and Crown pub. They paired off with the men around 11:45 p.m. Martha headed to George Yard, whilst Mary Ann headed to the parallel Angel Alley. So what happened after Martha and Mary Ann parted ways? And did one of the soldiers have anything to do with her death? Inspector Reed arranged an identification parade of the soldiers at the Tower of London, but Mary Ann was unable to identify any of the men. He then arranged another identification parade at the Wellington Barracks. This time Mary Ann picked out 2 men. However, both had solid alibis. Although the police didn't connect the murders of Emma and Martha, the newspapers did, and would begin to call them the Whitechapel Murders. And many people believe that Martha Tabram is the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Like the other women, 43-year-old Mary Ann Polly Nichols was an unfortunate. In the years since leaving her husband in 1880, she had stayed in various workhouses and common lodging houses. On the evening before her death, with no money for her bed, she had been turned away from Wilmot's lodging house. It didn't seem to faze her though. She left, saying, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." On the 31st of August 1888, Polly's body was found by Charles Cross, a carman who was on his way to work. Another man soon came along. However, neither wanted to be late for work, and they agreed to leave her there, but but report her whereabouts to the first policeman they came across. Although they soon ran into a policeman and reported the discovery, Polly had already been found by a policeman, PC John Neal, as he walked his beat. PC Neal summoned a nearby doctor, Dr. Llewellyn, who said that Polly had been dead no more than 30 minutes. Polly Nichols was the first of the Whitechapel murder victims to be strangled before having her throat cut, and she's also considered to be the first of the canonical 5, that is, the 5 victims believed to have been killed by Jack the Ripper. Annie Chapman was the second of the canonical 5. Like the other murder victims, 47-year-old Annie had been staying in lodging houses. She and her husband had split in 1884, and since then she had been staying in London's East End. Prior to her death, Annie had been staying in Crossingham's lodging house. However, like Polly, on the evening before her death, she didn't have the money for her bed, and she was turned away. Like Polly, she reassured the house deputy that she'd be back with the money and asked him to save her bed. Annie was confident she would earn her DOS money for the night. Instead, she would earn a place in history. On the 8th of September at 6 a.m, a resident of Hanbury Street, John Davis, noticed Annie's body at the entrance to the backyard. Davis attracted the attention of 3 men who went to find a policeman. Police surgeon George Baxter Phillips attended the scene and pronounced her dead, and he soon linked this murder to the previous murder of Polly Nichols. Elizabeth Stride was 44 years old and is the 3rd canonical victim. On the 30th of September 1888, at approximately 1 a.m, Louis Deemschutz headed into Dutfield's yard with his pony and cart. The pony stopped, refusing to go any further, and Louis Deemschutz got down to investigate what was going on and found a woman lying on the ground who he believed was either drunk or sleeping. He tried to rouse the woman, unsuccessfully, and he went into the nearby working men's club, where 2 men came out to help him. However, the 3 men, on further investigation, found that the woman wasn't dead or sleeping. She was dead. Dr. Frederick Blackwell was called to the scene and pronounced her dead at 1:16 a.m. Had Louis Deemschutz just interrupted Jack the Ripper in the act? And if so, where did the killer go next? Just as Elizabeth Stride was being discovered by Louis Deemschutz, 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes was being released from the Bishopsgate police station, where she had been taken into custody the evening before after she was found drunk. Bishopsgate fell under the City of London Police, and it was their procedure to release people when they were sober. If she had been arrested by the Metropolitan Police and being put in a Metropolitan Police jail, she would have been released the next morning, as per their procedures. At approximately 1:44 a.m, as PC Edward Watkins walked his beat through Mitre Square, he found Catherine laying in the corner. A second murder on the same day, within the span of an hour. Was this the Ripper's way of making up for being interrupted? And had his brutality just escalated? Like Polly, Annie and Elizabeth, her throat had been cut. But like Annie Chapman before her, the mutilations had increased in severity, and this time there were also facial injuries. If the previous murders were gruesome, nothing could have prepared the police for what they were about to find. 25-year-old Mary Jane Kelly is somewhat of an enigma. Very little is known about her early life, save for what she told those she knew, and no official documents relating to her life, to date, have ever been found. A woman with no clear past would soon become one with an infamous future. Mary Jane lived in a single room at Miller's Court. This made her slightly more fortunate than the other women in that she had a home. However, the reality was that although she had somewhere to go, the room didn't give her any comfort. And realistically, she endured conditions just as squalid as the other women. She was 6 weeks behind with her rent, and on the 9th of November 1888, at approximately 10:45 a.m, her landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant Thomas Bowyer to collect it. When there was no response to his knocks, Bowyer looked through the window to find Mary Jane lying on her bed, mutilated. Bowyer notified McCarthy, who went to see for himself before sending Bowyer to find a policeman. The mutilations were worse than any of the women. Mary Jane had been killed indoors, no need for speed, no interruptions. What the killer did was something that London had never seen before. So the term the Whitechapel Murders can be confusing because it refers to the Whitechapel Murders, but it also refers to the Jack the Ripper murders. But the canonical five that we've just looked at, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly, are distinguished from the other Whitechapel murders on the basis that the women were all prostitutes, the women had similar wounds, there were post-mortem organ removal and in some cases mutilations, except in Elizabeth Stride as it was believed that the killer was interrupted. However, this isn't a definitive list, and Martin Fido, who coined the term in 1987, said realistically there were between 4 and 8 victims of Jack the Ripper. Rose Mylett, born Catherine Millett, may not have been a murder victim at all. 26-year-old Rose had been married to a man named Davis, an upholsterer, and the two had had a daughter. However, they had split, and Rose had been staying at a common lodging house on 18 George Street. Rose was found in Clark's Yard off Poplar Street at 4:30 a.m. on the 20th of December 1888 by PC Robert Golding as he was walking his beat. There was some disagreement over the cause of Rose's death. 4 doctors examined Rose and believed that the cause of death had been strangulation. However, Robert Anderson believed that she had accidentally hung herself on the collar of her dress while she was drunk. He asked Dr. Thomas Bond to re-examine the body, and Bond agreed with Anderson. James Monroe, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, also suspected suicide or an accidental death, as there were no signs of a struggle. At the inquest into Rose's death, Coroner Wynne Baxter told the jury, "There is no evidence to show that the death was the result of violence." The jury ignored this and returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Little is known about 40-year-old Alice Mackenzie, though she is believed to be from Peterborough. Prior to her death, she had been staying in a lodging house at 52 Gun Street. She was found on Wednesday the 17th of July 1889 in Castle Alley, Whitechapel, and it's believed that she was killed around 12:40 a.m. Commissioner Monroe and Dr. Thomas Bond believed her to be a victim of Jack the Ripper. Her left carotid artery had been severed and her throat had been cut left to right. There were also abdominal mutilations, although these weren't as deep as the other victims. And it was also believed that the weapon used was a shorter bladed knife. And because of these differences, Dr. George Baxter Phillips and Inspector Frederick Aberline didn't believe that she was a victim of Jack the Ripper. At the inquest into her death, Coroner Baxter considered both possibilities, but concluded there is great similarity between this and the other class of cases which have happened in this neighbourhood, and if the same person has not committed this crime, it is clearly an imitation of the other cases. In other words, a copycat murder, a staged final scene, an attempt to mimic Jack the Ripper, perhaps using the fear he had created to cover up their own crime. On Tuesday the 10th of September at 5:15 a.m, a woman's torso was found under a railway arch in Pinchin Street, Whitechapel. The torso belonged to a woman aged between 30 and 40. The area was searched, but no other body parts were ever found. She had died the day before the discovery, and her body was covered in bruises that had been inflicted before death. There were also mutilations, much like those of the Jack the Ripper victims. However, police at the time didn't believe that she had been a victim of the Ripper. It was believed that this murder was linked to the Thames Torso murders. At the time, newspapers reported that the torso belonged to missing woman Lydia Hart. However, she was found days later in the hospital, having been on, quote, a bit of a spree. This victim was never identified. 32-year-old Frances Coles was the final woman whose death was attributed to the Whitechapel murders. Born in Bermondsey, she was the daughter of a bootmaker and had grown up in poverty. Frances was found at 2:15 a.m. on Friday the 13th of February 1891 in Swallow Gardens, Whitechapel by PC Ernest Thompson. And Thompson said that when he found her, he heard footsteps running away from the scene. The killer could have been just seconds away from being caught. Frances was still alive, but died very soon after PC Thompson's arrival. Her throat had been cut at least twice, and due to wounds found on the back of her head, it was believed that she was first thrown to the ground. There were no abdominal wounds, which led many to speculate that P.C. Thompson had interrupted the killer, as was the case with Elizabeth Stride. So who was the Whitechapel murderer? Well, the murderer or murderers were never identified. As stated earlier, at the time there were no differences made between the victims, and the sensationalist reporting by the newspapers grouped them all together under the Whitechapel Murders. So, was Jack the Ripper responsible for all 11 murders? Were violent East End gangs involved? Maybe one or two copycats? Domestic murders, purposely made to look like Jack the Ripper? Was the perpetrator of the Thames Torso murders involved? Or is Jack the Ripper responsible only for the canonical 5, albeit that there is some slight difference of opinion of some women who should or shouldn't be included? For example, many believe that Martha Tabram was the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Some believe that distinguishing the canonical 5 from the other Whitechapel murder victims has done them a disservice, as those interested in Jack the Ripper have focused more on them, taking those 5 into consideration when trying to determine the killer's identity. If the list is wrong, vital clues may be left out, and concentrating on the 5 also pushes the other 6 victims into the background. But it's human nature to sort things, isn't it? In this case, by similarity. Some have similarities, at least 7 had their throats cut. But many are also very different. For example, if you compare Emma Elizabeth Smith to Mary Jane Kelly. However, if you look at other serial killers, even the most notorious, they don't all kill in exactly the same way. There is often a consistent pattern throughout the murders, but they adjust as they learn and become more experienced, and also as the situation requires it. Of course, if the Whitechapel murders weren't all committed by Jack the Ripper, this would mean that there was a very similar killer or killers around at the same time, and this seems very unlikely. Even taking into account the relatively large population of East London at the time, or London as a whole, it would still be extremely unlikely to find 2 people with the same urge to kill and a similar method of doing so. Otherwise, when you take into account the world's population, you would expect to see hundreds of similar murders every year around the world. Some believe that there was one killer, Jack the Ripper, simply because he was interrupted, or that these were failed attempts. The file on the 11 Whitechapel murder victims remains unsolved, and without huge scientific advances, I don't think we'll ever know the identity of the murderer or murderers, which of the women's deaths they are responsible for, and indeed, if there are any other unidentified victims at their hands. Jack the Ripper's reign of terror may have ended in 1888, but his legacy lives on. Next time, we'll be looking at chilling cases of copycat killers, some strikingly similar, some disturbingly modern. You might be shocked at just how far his influence has spread, all the way to 2008. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.